housekeeping points. The first is we are recording this call. The second is, as we go through the presentation, please ask your questions in the chat window and we will get to them during the Q&A session, which will be after the presentation. And then this is our first call. If we have any technical issues, please bear with us. I think we're all working from home. I have a lot of power issues. I know you all do. I have a lot of internet issues. I know you all do. So if for any reason the call gets disconnected, please bear with us. Just stay on the call and we will do our best to resume as quickly as possible. So we want to know who's in the room. So I'm going to launch a poll. The question is, what action has your organization taken during COVID-19 pandemic? And it is a multiple choice. You should see the poll question pop up now on your screen. We're going to give everybody a few minutes to answer the question. So please try get your answers in. Fantastic, I can see everybody answering the questions. This just helps us understand what everybody has done so far. It also helps Jared, the speaker, understand where everybody is in terms of what steps in for HR that they've taken. So I'm going to give it just a few more seconds. Almost everybody now has answered. I'm going to end the poll in 5 seconds. Can we get the last 7 people in? 81% voted. I think that's fantastic. So I'm going to end that poll. So just so you know, so what action has your organization taken during the COVID-19 pandemic? We have the highest number, that's 37%, who have done none of the above, followed by 30% who have sent employees on paid leave. And then the other 3, it's about 10% each. So amended employee contracts, issued redundancy notices, and issued pay cuts. So interesting that the majority of the people either haven't done anything yet or have sent employees on leave. And then one more poll question. We want to understand where each of you are coming from, what industries you're in. So take a few seconds now to answer these questions so that we have a sense of who we're talking to, who the audience is. Great, I can see we're at 50% have voted. Great, we're at 80%, 8 more people to go. Fantastic, 90% have voted. I'll close it in a few seconds. And the poll is now closed. So we have quite a fantastic spread. Lovely. So 38% said other. But apart from that, we've got about 12% are in nonprofit and social development, Jared. We have 9% in consulting, 9% in legal, 9% in finance and investment, HR and recruitment as well, 9%, so quite a good split. And then we have about 6% in marketing and healthcare, and the rest are very minimal. So that's the general spread that we have on the call. Thank you so much for letting us know who you are. So I'm going to take just 2 minutes to introduce Ikigai to everybody before I hand over to the main speaker for today. So for those of you that are not our members and that don't know us, we are actually a wellness-focused co-working space. We now have 3 locations, one in Westlands, one in Lavington, and one in Lower Kabete, and we have a 4th location coming up on Riverside Drive as well. So what we do is we offer individuals, SMEs, startups, creatives, and large corporates with beautifully designed workspace where your team can be productive. And we really try hard to introduce memberships that are designed to be flexible, memberships that promote well-being, and really what we like to do is take the hassle out of running an office space for you so that you can focus on your core business. We're actually launching a new membership in this COVID-19 era. It's called Work from Home membership. And the idea of it is to allow people to stay connected with the business community, even as we're all working from home. Part of the membership, exclusive member-only events. We support you with advertising your services in our community. We have some incredible deals and discounts. We currently have a Microsoft Teams deal running until the end of May. We're also offering really great discounts on ergonomic chairs to make your home environment more work-friendly. We have exercise classes, yoga, meditation. You get access to our online portal so you can network, a business address, and really just all-round support. We launched this membership because it feels like we're living in a very new age with COVID-19, and no one has been spared. We know that so many of you are facing challenges related to the uncertainty that has arisen from the pandemic, both on a personal level and also on a professional level. And as Ikigai, it's always been our aim to add as much value to our members as possible, and the wider Nairobi community and the global community as well. So we really hope that events like the one today go a very long way in supporting your teams and your businesses. So we've moved all our events online. We have 4 main categories. This event is part of the Learn series. Our next event is a fantastic one. You don't want to miss it. It's titled How to Save Money on Your Insurance Premiums During a Pandemic. It's going to be run by JW Segon, a really, really good event. Our other 3 event categories are Breathe, Move, and Connect. So exercise classes, yoga, meditation, happy hours, and so much more. So if you're interested, please do join our mailing list so you can stay up to date with what we are doing. So on to the topic at hand today. As Ikigai, we've been feeling very lucky to have such a great legal partner in Kangwana and Company, because they have really guided us and held our hand through this really, really difficult time and the really difficult process of thinking through options such as unpaid leave versus paid leave, contract negotiations, contract renegotiations, and ultimately redundancies and all the legal requirements around this. So without any further ado, let me hand over to Jared Kangwana, who will be taking us through the presentation. And as a reminder, do get your questions in on the chat. Jared?
Hi, Nimbra. Thank you so much for such a welcoming, and to all of you, karibu sana. On this slightly gloomy afternoon in Nairobi, I hope you're all keeping well and keeping safe. As Nimbra has mentioned, my name is Jared Kangwana. I'm the principal at Kangwana & Co. And together with my colleague, Kevin Owino, who is on the line as well, we'll be doing this presentation, HR during a pandemic. So this presentation will be broken into 4 broad categories. The first one will be looking at bringing an end to contracts of employment during the current COVID pandemic. The second will be alternative measures to mitigate the cessation of employment contracts. The third, an overview of employers' duties. And finally, emerging issues that are typical in the current circumstances. So kind of a lot of the questions that we've been getting over the last few weeks since the pandemic struck Kenya. Just as a point to note, this presentation is really intended to be of general use and not to be relied on without seeking specific legal advice on the matter. We will answer specific Q&As at the end of this presentation, but if there's something specific to your business or to your employees, please feel free to reach out to us independently, and we'll be happy to guide you through that. So taking our first topic, we're going to look at redundancy and redundancy procedures, which I thought would have been top on the list of the polls, but I see it didn't poll quite highly. Now, employers may terminate an employee's contract on account of redundancy, provided that they believe it is for reasonable cause and that they are able to demonstrate that there are valid justifications for the proposed redundancy. Now, COVID-19 in itself can give rise to grounds of redundancy, as in most cases, it has resulted in reduced business, reduced cash flows, and the net effect being that a lot of positions have become superfluous in the current climate, which we'll kind of go into in a bit more detail later on in the presentation. Now, it's important to note that the process of redundancy can be tedious. It can be time-consuming and expensive to the employer. So what our advice would be is, if you're considering redundancy, consider it very, very carefully, and perhaps put it on the back burner as one of the last options you exercise in this current climate. So, as mentioned earlier, COVID-19 can give rise to grounds of redundancy for the reasons I mentioned: reduced business, reduced cash flow, which has led to positions being superfluous. Now, the burden of proof of the circumstances giving rise to redundancy lies with the employer. The employer, therefore, must be in a position to justify and rationalize its decision to declare any affected employees redundant. What this also means is that if the employer's decision is challenged, the burden of proof of the grounds giving rise to the redundancy does rest on the employer. It's therefore advisable that an employer has a document that sets out the business rationale for the redundancies. That's critical. Should an employer wish to rely on the COVID-19 pandemic as grounds for redundancy, then it must prove that the pandemic is reasonable cause, and also further demonstrate that there are valid justifications for the proposed redundancy as a result of COVID-19. Outside of COVID-19, and really this is just for informational purposes, there are the typical grounds that we see where people may exercise redundancy, and the list is there in front of you on the slide. So moving on to actually effecting the redundancy procedure. Now, we will refer to Section 41 of the Employment Act, and just for your records, that's Section 41 of the Employment Act, which sets out the mandatory conditions to be fulfilled by an employer before effecting a redundancy. Now, in summary, the two main points that you need to bear in mind. The first one is, before you effect a redundancy, where an employee is not a member of a trade union, the employer is required to notify the employee personally in writing and the Labour Office of the intended redundancy. This notification should be given to the employer at least 1 month prior to the effective date of the redundancy. It's our advice that the two notifications, one to the Labour Office and the other two to the employee, should be given at the same time, just to avoid any conflicts of effective dates or the date of the notice being given. The second point is, the law requires that in selecting employees to be declared redundant, an employer should have due regard to the seniority and time, and to the skill, ability, reliability of each employee in the category of employees that may be affected by the redundancy. Now, it's something that we see and hear a lot from most of our clients. They don't really want to hear the law, but they want to understand the practice and the practicality around it. So what I'm going to do is break down the redundancy procedure in a 4-step process, which is in line with what the law provides. The first step is the redundancy notice. So as previously discussed, an initial notification of redundancy should be sent out to the relevant employees. This notice should explain the reasons for and the extent of the redundancy. Secondly, again, still within the first step, the Labour Office should be notified of the intended redundancy, and in both cases, the notice period should not be less than 1 month from the date of the intended redundancy. Step 2 is the consultation phase. So during the 1 month notice period, employees should be invited to engage in consultations. The courts have indicated that at this stage, an employer should explain to the employee the rationale of the intended redundancy, and also give them an opportunity to make representations or raise concerns. employees should also be encouraged to express their views. In effect, as an employer should explain the reasons and the extent of the proposed redundancy, as well as the criteria applied in selecting the employees who may be affected by the redundancy. There is the last in, first out principle, which takes into account the years of service of an employee, which should be applied as part of the selection criteria. Other considerations such as skill, ability, reliability of the employee should also be taken into account. Now, the consultation should ideally include individual sessions with each employee, with the aim of giving them an opportunity to express any views or concerns that they would like to be addressed on a personal level. We completely understand that given the COVID-19 pandemic, this is probably not a practical suggestion, but in light of that, we believe that a video call would suffice in the current circumstances. Now, any discussions that are had with employees should be documented and minutes taken and signed by the employee and also by the employer. If you do intend to have group sessions, then attendance should be recorded, and the same thing, everyone involved in those sessions should sign off on the minutes thereof. So in certain circumstances, some employers have gone as far as to arrange a third-party counselor or advisor to meet with the employees to assist them plan their finances or provide psychological counseling and some support. This is not mandatory by law by any means, but really the idea here is to show that the decision made by the employer has been implemented reasonably and fairly and with due consideration to the needs and concerns of the employee. Step 3 is the confirmation of the redundancy. Now, at the expiry of the consultation period, which is the 30-day period, the employer can proceed to issue the affected employees with confirmation that they will be made redundant, which confirmation should also include the date of the effective date of the redundancy. It has to be noted that there is a bit of confusion as to whether this confirmation needs to be a second notice, i.e. in addition to and after the redundancy notice. Now, this has really been occasioned by a slightly inelegant drafting of Section 40(1)(f) of the Act. However, court decisions have confirmed that only one notice is required, and that's the initial notice that I discussed earlier. And subsequent to that, only confirmation of the redundancy needs to be given to the affected employees. So moving on, as I mentioned earlier, the redundancy process can be tedious, it can be time consuming, it can be expensive. And in addition, it can lead to the demotivation of remaining employees. And this is quite critical in the current circumstances, given that as it is right now, there's no end date to the pandemic that we're going through. Now, for these reasons, redundancy should be considered as a last option. And there are other alternative options that could and should be considered. Now, these include the following. So restricting overtime, for example, redeployment or retraining current employees, and sending employees on paid or unpaid leave, which is something we'll discuss later, and something I saw was polling quite high in terms of what most of you have implemented. And finally, varying contract terms, again, something that we will discuss later on in this presentation. So moving on to section 2 of the presentation. Under Kenyan law, the following are the statutory leave days that an employee can accrue during the tenure as an employee. And I'm sure all of you are aware of these. So we have maternity leave, paternity leave, sick leave, and annual leave. Through this section, though, we're going to focus on whether an employer can force employees to take outstanding leave days, both paid and unpaid, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So under the Kenyan Employment Act, the consent of an employee should be sought before an employer can force its employees to take their outstanding leave days. Now, in this section, For the next few slides, we will be focusing on Section 10.5. That's Section 10.5 of the Employment Act, which requires employers to consult the employees where any term and condition of the employment changes, and to notify the employees of any such change in writing. Now, the provisions of the Employment Act do refer to consultations, but they are silent on whether the consent of employees is required before a decision can be undertaken. That being said, case law does provide that employees' consent is required before any changes are effected to their contract terms. As employers, you should document the consent of employees. That's critical, and the reasons that you have asked them to take paid leave at the time requested for. So a question that arises quite often is whether employers should send their employees on leave with pay, whether they don't have any leave, if they don't have any accrued leave days. Sorry. So an employer is not obligated to request its employees who do not have any accrued days to proceed on leave with pay. It is recommended if the company or if the employer has the financial ability to pay its employees in such circumstances, then it should exercise that option. But just to be very clear, it is not an obligation. This is very discretionary on the part of the employer. In such a scenario, it is plausible for a company to inform employees without leave days that the leave will be recovered from the next year. So we're looking into 2021 annual leave days. However, this would be regarded how this would be regarded in a year from now is anyone's guess. These are unprecedented times that we're going through. So it's uncertain whether the courts would favor such a decision if challenged by an employee at a future date. So the next section, we'll be looking at sending employees on unpaid leave. So similarly to the requirements for sending an employee on paid leave, the consent of an employee to be sent on unpaid leave is also required. It's important to understand that in the absence of their consent, forcing an employee to go on unpaid leave is a fundamental change to their contract of employment and may be regarded as an effective termination. So in this scenario, even though consent has been sought and granted by the employee, there is a risk that employees may argue that they were unduly influenced to agree to the variation of their current terms and conditions of employment. So in order to mitigate these risks, employees should be required to do the following. So number one is to acknowledge that they have not been forced or pressured into the variation of the terms and conditions of their employment, and that they agree to the varied employment contracts voluntarily based on the unprecedented economic circumstances and economic distress facing companies and the economy generally. The second is employees should acknowledge that they've been advised to seek independent legal advice. Now, the requirement for independent legal advice is recommended, again, but not mandatory under law. Is documented if they are able to seek that independent legal advice. So outside of leave days, so whether paid or unpaid, it is permissible for an employer to vary the contracts of employment with employees to ease pressures that we're all facing occasioned by COVID-19. As we discussed earlier, under Kenyan law, the consent of an employee should be sought before an employer can vary the terms of the employment contract. Section 10.5 of the Employment Act requires employers to consult with their employees where any term or condition of their employment changes and to notify them of that in writing. Now, in addition to consultations, case law requires that employees' consent is required before changes are effected. I have repeated this purposely, and it is important to remember you must consult and you must seek consent before making any changes. So the typical types of variations that we see in the current circumstances include the following, which you can see in the slide in front of you. So variation to the hours of work, we'll discuss this a bit later. The name of the employer, where perhaps you have a group reorganization, job description, place of work, remuneration, and in terms of remuneration, the scale or rate of remuneration, and the method of calculating remuneration. And finally, the intervals at which remuneration will be paid. Good. So on to part 3 of this presentation. We are going to look at the duties of employers during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the Occupational Health and Safety Act 2007, more commonly referred to as OSHA, imposes a legal obligation on employers to take various measures to ensure that the workplace is safe for all employees. Employers must therefore put in place measures to protect their employees from the spread of COVID-19 at the workplace. So examples of the measures that employers can take are as listed in the slide in front of you. It's important to note that if an employee is infected at their place of work, the employer is liable under the Work Injury Benefits Act 2007, again commonly referred to as WIBA. And this act works to compensate an employee for work-related infections. This compensation, and it's important to note this compensation is separate, distinct, and in addition to any form of health insurance, whether private or the mandatory NHIF that your employee should be on. It's important to note as well that infections, and now just dealing with infections given the COVID-19 pandemic, infections resulting from a deliberate and willful misconduct of the employee are exempt under WIBA. So moving on to the fourth and final part of this presentation, we're going to discuss some of the emerging issues that have arisen in the workplace as a result of COVID-19. And again, some of the typical questions that we get from our clients and have received from our clients over the last few weeks. So the first question we are going to look at is, can an employer force an employee to work from home? So employment contracts often provide that the employee's place of work shall be place X, typically the registered office of the employer or the company, or such other place as the employer may be notified. In such a case where such provisions do exist in employment contracts, it is plausible for the employer rather to ask the employee to work from home. That being said, even without such a provision being in an employment contract, if the reason is to ensure that the health and safety of employees, if the reason is for employees to work home being their health and safety, then an employer would have good grounds for requiring employees to work from home. Now, in this particular scenario, we would, and I would advise that you heavily rely on the government directives for people to stay home and to work from home as good grounds to direct your employees to work from home. So if an employee is required to be in the office, but refuses to do so without any reasonable basis for fear of coming to work, their absence should be deducted from their leave days. This being said, an employer should always extend reasonableness before deducting an employee's leave days on that basis. The second topical question that we are going to discuss is, can the quarantine period be deducted from an employee's annual or sick leave? Now, if an employee is quarantined, which is different and distinct from an employee being self-isolated or working from home, this period should be deducted from their sick leave. Where the period exceeds the employee's sick leave entitlement, then such period should be deducted from the employee's annual leave. Later on in this presentation, I'm going to look at a scenario where an employee does not have any remaining leave days and has exhausted their sick leave days as a result of being quarantined. The next question we're going to address is, can an employee be asked to reduce the number of hours they work so that they're paid based on the number of hours that they work and salary reduced accordingly? So yes, an employer may request its employees to reduce the number of hours that they work so that they're paid based on the actual numbers of hours worked. However, and I've said this before, the employer must consult with the employees prior to making any such amendments to their working hours and to their salaries, as required again under Section 10(5) of the Employment Act. Secondly, the employer's consent must be obtained before effecting any such changes. Employers should document the consent of the employees and the reasons for the reduction of their working hours and salaries. Remember, and I keep stressing this, consult and seek your employees' consent before making any fundamental variations to the terms of engagement with you. So finally, and the last question that we're going to tackle today before we move on to the Q&A is, do employers still need to pay full salaries to employees if the nature of the job is that they are unable to work remotely, but need to stay at home to be safe from the virus? So subject to any variation of contract terms, yes, employers still need to pay full salaries to employees if the nature of the job is that they are unable to work remotely, but need to stay at home to be safe from the virus. In this scenario where employees rather are working from home or are home rather and are unable to carry out their job description, employers can ask employees to perform a job that is not their core function, but one that can be performed remotely. Again, this would require consultation and the consent of employees before doing so. So that brings an end to this part of the presentation. I will hand over to Washuka and the team at Ikigai to moderate the Q&A and answer some of the questions that have arisen from the presentation.
Thank you so much, Jared. Very, very insightful. I think why we like this presentation so much is it's really very practical advice that everybody can follow. I think just to reiterate, when we were going through the process with you, I think the biggest take home for me was that, consent. You need to get consent and everything needs to be documented. I think that was really one of the major takeaways. And also the fact that as we went along on the journey, we realized how rigorous the process actually is. And we were quite pleased as well with the social protections that are in place. So thank you so much for this presentation. We have quite a few questions. I'll start with Pamela's question. And her question is, in the event that you are not able to give an employee a 1-month notice, is it sufficient to pay them the 1 month in lieu of notice?
Yeah, Pamela, thanks for that question. Absolutely. I mean, the simple answer to your question is yes. The Employment Act does allow you to pay them the 1 month lieu of notice. That being said, it is critical that the initial notice is given to the employee and is given to the Labour Office. That you cannot escape from. And the reason I say it is in the event that you do not give those notices, the process could be challenged by the employee. And in effect, if judgment is given in favor of the employee, you are looking at either reinstatement in certain circumstances, or a penalty of up to 12 months pay due to not.
Great. Sorry, Jared, you had frozen temporarily on my side. I hope I'm not interrupting you. And I hope everybody can still hear me, because I think looks like Jared has frozen. Is it only on my side from my team? Yeah, okay, somebody else has lost Jared. So let's just give him a few more minutes to try and rejoin the call. You can keep your questions coming while he tries to rejoin. Jared, are you back? Yeah, you look like you're back. Great. Yeah, you're muted now. Let me unmute you.
Hi, what's your number? I can hear you. I can hear perfectly fine.
Wonderful. Yeah, we just lost you temporarily. So
No problem.
I wasn't sure if I'd interrupted you, but our next question is from Rina. She asks, in an instance where employees have a pension, where the employer contributes into the pension investment, can we assume that severance pay will not be required?
No, the pension will remain as is, and severance pay will still need to be paid. Consider the pension as a savings scheme and not part and parcel of an employee's remuneration.
Okay, okay, great. So yeah, so they still have to pay severance. All right, next question is from Mimi. In cases where we have companies issuing backdated redundancy notices to employees to be signed and given leave for the period of notice, would this require legal action from the part of the employee, or do they have a basis on this?
So the process is very clear. Before any redundancy procedure is undertaken, those notices must be given to the employees prior to any action being taken. So backdated letters, unfortunately, are not sufficient. And remember that the Labour Office does also have to be notified, and it would be remiss for the Labour Office to accept backdated this question. There are grounds for an employee to bring cause against an unprocedural procedure being taken by the employer.
Okay, great. We have a similar question from Amir and Claire, so I'll read them both out. Amir asks, what happens where an employee does not give consent to, say, a pay cut or being sent on unpaid leave? Is the employer held at ransom and unable to alter the terms of the contract? And Claire asks, what happens if the employees don't consent to the variation in employment terms? Has Jared frozen? He looks like he's frozen. It is probably raining on his side because it looks like it's about to start raining here. Let me know in the chat window if I'm the only one that has lost him. Yeah, okay, you guys have to. Let's just give him a few moments. These are the challenges of working from home. Yeah, we lose connection always. I think it's been happening to us a lot on our different calls. So if it does keep happening, what we will do is we will compile all of the questions that you've asked, some really great questions, and he will create an FAQ and send it out to everybody on the call along with the recording. So let's just give him a few more seconds, and then if he's not able to rejoin, and I think his partner should be on the call as well. If he's not able to rejoin, then we can call it a day and send everybody the questions and answers. All right, I see he looks like he's back. Hi, Jared, you're back. Okay, we're wondering if it was raining on your side. Can you hear us?
Hi, Nyambura, can you hear me?
Hi, you're back. All right, great.
I'm back. I'm so sorry about that. So the last question I had from you was from Mimi.
Yes, wonderful. So I had asked a question from Amir and Claire. Basically, what happens if employees don't give consent for either variation in the employment terms or pay cuts or to be sent on unpaid leave? Is the employer held at ransom and unable to alter the contract terms?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and I wouldn't quite say that the employee would be held at ransom. The employer's obligations to still pay remuneration will exist. We can't force the hand of an employee to consent to going on leave, whether paid or unpaid. Now, for an employee, it is a difficult situation, and at some point they will have to make a commercial decision as to whether they can afford to retain their employees in the current circumstances. And if they are unable to, then redundancy is an option that they may exercise. Remember, the grounds must be justified and must be reasonable.
So the next question is coming from Faith. She says, is the removal of some benefits to the employees allowed without consent? So I think she's asking specifically about a benefit, let's say airtime or something like that, without consent from the employee.
So no, and all benefits
Yes, we have lost him again. I guess I would suggest at this point, we've only got 10 minutes left in the call, and we have some, oh, he's back. Jared, can you hear us? You froze again.
Sorry, I'm sorry, it's that time of the day where my internet decides to misbehave.
Yeah, don't worry, it happens to all of us. It's, yeah, working from home and internet dropping and power and all of that.
Yeah. So I don't know if you had my response to the last question on benefits.
Yes, consent still needs to be given.
Correct.
Okay.
And just to clarify, all benefits that accrue to an employee during the term of employment will remain the same despite the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, wonderful. Joy asks, should variation in remuneration be an option? How does KRA come in legally because change in remuneration affects payee?
Yeah, so change in remuneration is plausible in a simple sense, but then again, consent is required, and whether that consent is given is a very different question. So yes, to the first part, the variation can happen. In terms of KRA, it's not so much of an issue. When you are remitting your pay, you just have to recalculate the 30%, which is now likely to be reduced to 25% given COVID, and recalculate the new remuneration according to the new pay scale.
Okay, great. Ruth asks, can the employer force an employee to work from the office when the fear of exposure in the office is real?
Absolutely not. If the fear of exposure is real, you shouldn't force your employees to work from the office. Remember, as we went through the presentation, there is liability that will rest on the employer under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and also compensation to the employee if they get sick under WIBA. So my suggestion would be, if there's a real risk, keep your employees at home.
Okay, fantastic. Mimi asks, if the government directive is to extend one's quarantine, resulting into absence of leave, wouldn't it be unfair to keep on deducting one's annual leave?
I mean, that's a very fair point to Mimi, and as I mentioned in the presentation, I think a level of reasonableness must be exercised by the employer. So if you find that the quarantine period has been extended and the employee has exhausted their sick leave days, I think a reasonable employee would be happy to extend their sick leave days in that scenario. You're not obliged to, but I think a reasonable employee would, employer rather, would give them that option.
Okay, great. Amir's question: I do not believe that contracts in Kenya often contain clauses for temporary layoffs or force majeure clauses. Can the doctrine of frustration apply to contracts of employment?
That is a very good question, Amir, and it's something that we have received a lot. Now, from our position, frustration, or typically called or clauses typically referred to as force majeure in employment contracts, would probably not stand the test of the courts. Remember, our acts and our employment acts and decisions made by the court tend to lean in favor of the employee. So where you have a contract that gives an employer an option, quite an easy option to opt out of an employee-employee arrangement, it's unlikely to be withheld. What you'll find is that any action taken by the employer will be regarded as an effective termination or redundancy, subject to the circumstances. At the second point, in terms of a temporary termination, not something that exists in Kenya.
Okay, great. Can you explain a bit more doctrine of frustration, just for anybody that might not understand what that means?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in a simple sense, it will occur in circumstances where either party is unable to fully fulfill their obligations under the contract for reasons which are outside of their control. Thereby the contract is frustrated and you bring it to an end. Typically found in commercial arrangements, but not in employment contracts.
Okay, fantastic. Hope that was helpful for everybody. We have a question from Pat or Pato. For employees who are offered alternative tasks, i.e. they are redeployed, and they're not able to take up the alternative employment tasks available from their employer, is the employer still obliged to keep and pay such employees? Do payee, NHIF, NSSF, etc. contributions have to be sustained by the employers, and if yes, for how long?
Sure. Okay. So number of questions there. So Patrick. So on to the first one, I think if you are going to give an employee an alternative job or task to undertake, you must also know that the employee is able to perform that task, whether it's in their skill set or whether they have the facilities that would enable them to carry out that task. If neither of those are possible, then it wouldn't be wise to even ask an employee to take on a different task. Now, secondly, in terms of NHIF, NSSF, pay, all of those are still payable until we get any other government directive. Right now, it's still a mandatory requirement, and those remittances must be made. Thirdly, if an employee is unable, not unwilling, but unable to take on a different task assigned to them, those really are not grounds for you to terminate them, because bearing in mind that the reason you employed them was for a specific task. So you just have to look at the whole scenario holistically and ask yourself whether it is reasonable to ask the employee to do what you're asking them to do.
Great. So generally, with all the directives that we're getting now on the news, it is best to wait for it to come out in some formal manner. I know there's like VATs at 14%. All the taxes have reduced, but what's your advice on that in terms of waiting? Yeah,
so my advice is 100% to wait. Now, just before we got into this call, I was reading an article on the Business Daily. Now, some of you might be aware that there was a tax amendment bill that was put to Parliament. I think it was on Tuesday last week, which made some changes. Now, for employees, it would mean that people earning under 24,000 would be exempt from payee. Income tax would reduce from 30% to I think 25 or 24%. Don't quote me on that. It's either one of the two. Now, what this article said is it has not been assented to yet. So do not rely on what you see on TV. Do not rely on what you read on the media. Speak to your legal advisor. We are continually putting out laws as they are gazetted, and that is what you need to rely on. So until you have actual published and assented to laws, do not rely on what you're reading. There's a lot of fake news, a lot of fake information that's out there, and for your protection as an employer and as an employee to know exactly what your rights are, just wait until you have verified information.
Okay, great. Pato just had a quick follow-up before I get to the other two questions. He said, I mean alternative tasks within their skills. So if the people are being redeployed, but they're being redeployed within their skill set, but they're still unwilling to take up that new job, then what is your take?
Yeah, so my take on that is, again, first thing, reasonableness. And I get what Pato is saying, that if it is within the skill set, that's fine. Again, consent is required. If that consent is not forthcoming, then we then have to start looking at redundancy as an option. Remember, redundancy can be triggered where a particular position is regarded as superfluous. So if the initial job description of that employee is no longer relevant or cannot be undertaken in these current circumstances, and they are unwilling to take up another task, then redundancy is something that an employer should consider and look at if consent is not forthcoming.
Okay, great. The next question was sent privately, so I'll not mention a name. It says, if the employee is on maternity leave, can they be declared redundant?
Yes, they can. Yes, they can. Now, one must be extremely careful about this, extremely careful about this. If someone is on maternity leave, if someone is on sick leave, redundancy still can go ahead. But the employer must make it very, very, very clear that the reason that they have been considered as part of the pool that may be affected by redundancy, we cannot discriminate. We're looking at the job that they're doing, and whether that, simply put, yes, if someone is on maternity, they can go, they can be part of the redundancy procedure. If they are declared redundant, then part of their severance package will include their accrued but untaken maternity leave or accrued and untaken sick leave.
Okay, great. Another question, what happens where it is difficult to get consent for variation in contract terms, particularly when dealing with employees who may not be reachable via internet? Looking at some members of staff in lower cadre jobs.
Sure, I mean, you then have to really, the basic point here is consent must be given, and how you go about it. You need to exercise all options you have in terms of accessing these employees. I mean, let's take a step away from the current circumstance. If you needed to contact an employee for something urgent, an emergency, whatever it might be, how would you get in contact with that employee? Now, those are the same means and mechanisms that you would use to speak to that employee and to have the discussion around consent with them.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to just take, there are many more questions which we will have to get to after because we've only got about 2 more minutes left. I'm going to give 2 more. Salary cuts. This is from Ruth. Is there a timeline, and should the period that the employee will consent for a salary cut be included in the notice to receive a pay cut, or is the period open-ended?
Okay, so just to clarify, you can give them a period in which to consent or not to consent. Now, you really have to get a sense of the employee or the group of employees that you're seeking consent from. Are these people who will act quickly? Are these people who need time? So there's no straight answer as to what the period looks like or what it should be. You need to take it on a case-by-case basis and make that assessment. Now, for me, if I sat in the shoes of an employer, even if that period ends, I would be open to perhaps extending it a little bit longer just to give employees a bit more time. It's got to be fair. You've got to make them feel comfortable. Don't let them feel coerced or pressured into making this decision.
All right. And then for the last question, do NHIF and NSSF NITA contributions have to be sustained by employers if the employees are on unpaid leave?
Yes, they do. They absolutely do. So in as much as the individual is your employee, those statutory deductions must still be paid. And as I was saying earlier, and unless we get any other directive from the government or from NHIF or NSSF respectively, continue paying those remittances.
All right, great. I'm just going to sneak in Yaniv's questions here.
Yeah.
What should a company tell employees if we have confirmed a confirmed instance of an employee infected by coronavirus? And as a follow-up, may I require temperature screening of employees and or return to work from a physician for an employee returning from an illness?
Yeah, so I missed the first part of the question. Do you mind, the first question rather, do you mind repeating it?
Yeah, what should a company do? What should a company tell employees if they have a confirmed case of COVID?
Okay, so if a company does have a confirmed case of COVID, remember we must respect the rights of any employee, and we can almost equate it to having an employee with a severe illness of whatever form. It would be better to inform the employees generally that there has been a confirmed case of COVID amongst staff, but it's not necessary to inform employees of who that particular individual is. Now, in doing so, perhaps consider employees who may have been in close contact with the person who is ill, and have a separate conversation and confidential conversation with them about the particular individual who has been confirmed ill. And that's just for their protection. And again, that's just to protect any liabilities that might fall on you as an employer. Do you mind repeating the second question, please?
Yeah, it was about temperature screening. So
yeah.
Is he allowed to require his employees that are coming back to work to be temperature screened?
Yes, absolutely. So as I mentioned during the presentation, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, among other things, it requires an employer to make sure that the workplace is safe from any injury, death, or infection that might affect employees coming in and out of the workplace. Following in that thread, it is permissible for an employee to have temperature checks at the entrance for anyone coming back into work as a measure that an employer is taking to protect other employees in the workplace. All
right, fantastic. And I'm going to cheat because we only have one more question, which will have gone to everybody's question. It's from Niru. If our employer had let go some staff based on redundancy, is it a must that they pay severance? They said they paid NSSF, therefore severance pay is not applicable. Is that true? No, not at all. The law is very clear. Severance must be paid and must be paid at a rate of not less than 15 days for every completed year of service. All right. And I think I would add on to that, speaking directly to Niru now, do what you can to pay the severance pay. In absence of that, the employees affected by the redundancy do have a window open to move to court and to bring a claim for an undue procedure. And as I mentioned earlier, you could potentially look at a case of reinstatement and or a penalty of up to 12 months salary. All right, Jared, thank you. It has been so informative. We're actually 4 minutes after, but we managed to get to everybody's questions. We are going to send out the slides and the recording. You can reach out to Ikigai or Jared if you have any more questions. I think from Ikigai's point of view, we've been going through this process as a business, and it's such a time of high anxiety personally and professionally for everyone. And we found that it's really critical when dealing with redundancies to do it through a lens of empathy and openness and transparency together with your team. And we found it's actually a really good opportunity to improve your communication and trust, and also brand loyalty with your employees. So also important to look at it through that lens. I really want to thank you, Jared and Kangwana and Co, as well as the rest of the Ikigai team that helped put this together. Reach out to us if you have any comments, feedback, and questions. As I mentioned, we have a fantastic Never Learn series coming up, how to save money on your insurance premiums during a pandemic. So sign up for our newsletter if you want to hear about that. And thank you for bearing with us through some of the technical difficulties. Thank you all so much. We were about 55 people strong, which is great. So hope to see you on our next call. Thank you very much and have a lovely, lovely evening. Bye, Jared.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye, guys. Take care.
Bye.